Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Today I'm joined by a very important guest, James Barnett. James is a research fellow at the Houston Institute. James specializes in African security and geopolitics. He's got extensive fieldwork experience in conflict environments, especially in Nigeria, but also in Somalia, South Sudan, and other places. James is also the editor of Houston Institute biannual journal, Current Trends in Islamist Ideology, and he's currently a doctorate student at the University of Oxford. James, I'm so pleased to have you with us today, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks so much, Michael. Appreciate the invitation.
Good. So today we're going to be discussing recent events in Somaliland, but first, I think we need to start off by saying by asking what is Somaliland? Can you tell our listener uh, you know Somaliland, where is Somaliland located? Where is Somaliland? Is it the same as Somalia?
Sure.
What is Somaliland? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Michael. Well, I guess the question is it the same as Somalia? Depends who you ask in the region, and it's now a very relevant and very sensitive issue and kind of at the heart of some emerging kind of geopolitical fault lines in the region. So Somaliland is a de facto independent state that to date has not been internationally recognized by anyone, but it essentially covers, based on the borders that the Somaliland state claims, it covers roughly a third of the total Somali territory, and particularly the northern arm that's kind of lies adjacent to the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, for those who are familiar with Somali geography. And Somaliland was, in the colonial era, the kind of traditional lands inhabited by the Somali people, who are a very kind of widely dispersed kind of ethnic and national group. The lands that were inhabited by the Somali people were colonized by different powers, by the French, by the British, the Italians, the Ethiopians, in what is today modern Eastern Ethiopia. And so the part of the Somali territories that the British colonized was referred to as British Somaliland, and then in 1960 achieved independence very briefly as its own independent state before joining into a union with the rest of southern Somalia to form what is today the internationally recognized Republic of Somalia, or the state of Somalia. So Somaliland, though, for those who are kind of familiar with the history of the Horn of Africa, Somalia really kind of descended into a very intense civil war, and starting in the late 1980s, with kind of the rebel movements and kind of falling along different clan and regional lines within the country. And so there was one particular movement from the Isak clan, which is very popular and are predominant up in northern Somalia. That's the territory of Somaliland. That was called the Somali National Movement, or SNM. And so this group was among many others that were fighting against the dictator, Mohammed Siad Barre, who was employing kind of very indiscriminate, kind of quasi-genocidal tactics against certain clans in the country, including the Isaaq in the north. So when Siad Barre was eventually overthrown in 1991, the Isaaq clan and the people of that kind of British Somaliland, the former colony of British Somaliland, the former independent state, short-lived independent state of Somaliland, kind of redeclared their independence from the broader kind of state of Somalia. This was a unilateral decision, though, so it was never recognized by any subsequent Somali government or any international actors. However, because of the nature of the Somali Civil War and the fact that the Somali government, after Siad Barre, for many years really was non-existent. It only existed on paper, and even today in 2024, the Somali government is still quite weak and struggling to kind of consolidate or expand its influence in most parts of the country. But so what had happened in Somalia since 1991 was you had a bunch of different kind of local political entities forming up generally along clan lines and stuff and establishing de facto authority, de facto administration, while the central government, the federal government, was again, largely kind of a figment of imagination. It existed. It was either, it was based in exile until 2006, then it was in a very nascent form until 2012, and even over the past 12 years, the federal government, as I said, has still been kind of getting built up. But among these different kind of local forms of administration, the Republic of Somaliland became the one that was of all those different kind of groups. It achieved the strongest kind of de facto authority, de facto control, and really built up kind of state institutions. So by the early 2000s, you could say that Somaliland was kind of a de facto independent state. Again, it had achieved its independence or claimed its independence from the rest of Somalia, and very crucially, it used as its kind of legal context the fact that it had been an independent state for 5 days in 1960 before joining into that union with Somalia. So it claimed, based on that precedent, that this is not just a unilateral secession, that there had been a union that had involved the two parties agreeing to, form an independent nation, an independent nation state. But then one of those parties was withdrawing because, of that failed experiment, if you will. So ever since then, Somaliland has been achieving or been kind of claiming independence. But it's been an issue that the international community, led largely, and sorry, I use that term kind of, I'm not actually a big fan of that term,
Loosely.
international
Yeah,
community.
no.
Well, I mean, the various actors that would kind of, the other countries that are engaged and involved in the Horn of Africa that would take kind of a strong position on this, but kind of largely for uh, reasons related to kind of concerns from other African states. So, the 54 nations or 53 other nations that comprise the African Union and such. Of course, because of the strong secessionist and separatist tendencies in a lot of African countries, and because of the way in which borders were drawn during the colonial era, there's a lot of apprehension among a lot of other African countries about recognizing a breakaway region, even if it has achieved de facto independence and sovereignty. So for the past few years, there's kind of been this, Somaliland on paper, in the eyes of the so-called international community, is part of Somalia, but in effect, it's been its own country. And up until relatively recently, it's also been it kind of had much more stability than the rest of Somalia, and we can talk a bit more about that because that's where some of my recent research has been. Um, but so, in recent years, Somaliland has started kind of becoming more competent and trying to make a stronger case for countries to recognize its independence, because again, it's now been 30 plus years since they've declared this kind of the separation from Somalia, and in recent years, really since the early 2000s, they've been building up their own governments. They print their own currency. They have been holding regular elections, though those have now been delayed, which is one source of some of the current internal issues the country's facing. um,
Mhm.
but yeah, I mean, as I assume you'll kind of want to discuss a bit, this question of whether or not to recognize Somaliland is something that has not been a major, I'd say, kind of like political flashpoint for a lot of international actors in
mm,
recent years. It's been, something that, for example, in the U.S. Government, the kind of State Department is kind of runs on autopilot and our view as well. Okay, we recognize Somalia, that's our policy. So the U.S. kind of doesn't really like to comment on this stuff, even though it recognizes that these are two de facto independent entities.
mm,
Um,
mm,
but of course, this has all been thrown into into the spotlight recently because of this memorandum of understanding that was signed on January 1st between Ethiopian President Abiy Ahmed and then the Somaliland president Musa Bihi, which
mm,
reportedly, supposedly contains a promise from Ethiopia to recognize Somaliland and become the first international country to recognize Somaliland in return for Somaliland granting Ethiopia port access. The whole thing is a bit confused by the fact that we haven't seen the text of the MOU. Ethiopia
mm.
has kind of given a slightly different narrative about what's happened. But yeah, that's to just kind of very quickly bring us up from
That's a very comprehensive summary. Very, very
yeah, thanks.
comprehensive,
Sorry.
and it's not easy to put that long history in that in this very short. But you've done excellently well with that, and so many things you've said.
Thank you.
But let me start from the irony or the paradox between Somalia itself that we've
Mhm,
seen in the last how many years. At one point, it didn't have a government, and we were talking about the recognized Somalian state. And then
mhm,
we talk about issues of Al Shabaab. It's been bedeviled with insecurity. Then we talk about the Fatu land, Somaliland, Republic of Somaliland, that is not recognized. Having enjoying the stability and this, what you call a relatively um, level of democracy in terms of elections, in terms of having institutions. How do we see this irony? And talking about how a state that is unstable with all of these security or issues being the one that is recognized and the one that has shown this kind of stability not being recognized. And then
yeah, well,
at the back of okay, go on. You can answer this. I'll come back to what I was going to say.
okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess there are kind of two different questions, right? What explains the relative stability of Somaliland as opposed to Somalia over the past 3 decades? Though again, I think since last year, Somaliland has really been experiencing some serious internal crises. So that's
Mm,
maybe we can discuss after. But so that's one question. The other question is how to explain the kind of issue of recognition. I think in terms of the issue of recognition, it's been essentially it's been partially just the fact that there's no single country that has felt kind of so forcefully about the need to recognize Somaliland or had it in their interest to such an extent that they would become the first to do so and therefore establish that precedent. That's one reason why the Somali government, I think, is very concerned about this MOU with Ethiopia. There are a lot of reasons that it's very sensitive and polarizing, but one reason is that I think that if one country, if a big country like Ethiopia, which is obviously a heavyweight kind of regional player, were to recognize Somaliland, maybe others would follow suit. Maybe not, because Ethiopia's foreign policy has alienated a lot of its neighbors in recent years. So there's a whole kind of complex regional dimension there. But in terms of Somaliland not achieving recognition, as I said, a lot of it has come down to kind of opposition from the other African states that fear kind of setting a precedent of kind of states breaking away and stuff. Um, the two recent examples within the African context of kind of states achieving independence, breaking away from larger states would be South Sudan and Eritrea. But in both of those cases, there was a degree of kind of internal consensus, even though in the case of Sudan, it was kind of to some extent forced by, the US and Europeans and others. But essentially, that as part of the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement in that country, there was, the Sudanese government allowed for a kind of an internal referendum that would determine, okay, do the people want to stay in Sudan or do the Southerners want to break apart and form their own country? Kind of similar with Ethiopia and Eritrea, what happened in the early 90s. So I think the position of a lot of actually international actors, they've kind of realized that, okay, Somaliland is de facto independent. Somalia's, its politics are very turbulent and stuff, But because there are these institutional and international norms, particularly in the African context, about we don't recognize breakaway regions that don't also have kind of the internal consensus from the larger state to break away. And so I think the thinking or the hope had been for a while that there would be these negotiations, these dialogues between the government in Somalia and the government in Somaliland, and that they would reach some sort of solution that would provide some clarity kind of moving forward. But the key was that, for a country like the US or the UK or others, I think that they didn't want to be seen as just as recognizing a breakaway province that the central, that the kind of larger state um, doesn't recognize, right? Because that would create a bad precedent. Potentially, people would see this as kind of the neo-colonial redrawing of boundaries and such. And so it's very important for countries like US, UK, and others that, if they were eventually going to recognize Somaliland, that it would be kind of a Somali-led process. So they would just be, oh, well, we're just recognizing the reality on the ground and what the Somalis and Somalilanders have already agreed to. So I think that's kind of the institutional, or the kind of the maybe the more cautious approach, I would say, from international actors in recent years, and then again grounded in that concern by from the majority of African states about the risks of recognizing countries, breakaway regions. Within Africa, again, given the history of how of state formation essentially on the continent. In terms of what explains the relative the kind of stability of Somaliland as opposed to southern Somalia and the security challenges in the latter, that's a very big complex question. I think that one, I don't think that this is a monocausal explanation, but I think that one interesting and important point in kind of distinguishing between the two is that Somaliland, for a long time, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, when it was building up its own kind of institutions and stuff, it didn't have really any support from kind of Western partners, from UN, international agencies, all of that. It really kind of did have to, I mean, to use a bit of a hackneyed phrase, kind of pull itself up from its bootstraps. But it did avoid, I think, to some extent, some of the dependency issues that have, kind of bedeviled countries like Somalia or South Sudan or these other kind of very weak African states that kind of are just kind of propped up by, international, kind of donors and stuff year in, year out. I think, though, that's also not quite being, that certainly doesn't explain everything, and it's not being entirely fair to what's happened in Somalia either, because while certainly the issues of dependency and kind of aid dependency and stuff have been a very serious issue in southern Somalia, it's also just the fact that for a variety of reasons, that the major kind of security threat, right, that Al-Shabaab has consolidated its influence in southern and central Somalia as opposed to northern Somalia. So even within the parts of Somalia that have not declared secession, so like in Puntland State, for example, in northern Somalia, which borders Somaliland, this is a highly autonomous state that is in some ways, more kind of a bit more stable than southern Somalia. They've not declared independence. They're still, they recognize the Somali federal government, even though they have a very kind of hot and cold relationship with them. But the Al-Shabaab also doesn't have a very strong presence in Puntland. So part of it is just a kind of question of where the group has found kind of fertile ground to expand. And then also I think that there's an argument to be made that beyond this question of kind of the dependency on aid or foreign assistance, the interventions by regional militaries, first the Ethiopians in 2006. This was an invasion that the Ethiopians launched with kind of tacit U.S. support to attack Islamist militants, but it ended up really kind of catalyzing al-Shabaab. And that invasion, again, was largely targeted in kind of the southern and central parts of the country. So, the repeated kind of histories of intervention, and then you've had in recent years the Kenyans and the Ethiopians both kind of operating within the AU peace enforcement mission, formerly known as AMISOM, now known as ATMIS. And that's a mission that's doing very good, very important work, but you also have kind of like political considerations and stuff at play where you have, Ethiopians and Kenyans sometimes competing with each other via proxy for influence in southern Somalia. So it's, I mean, these kind of issues are a bit, I guess there's a bit of a feedback loop, right? They're a bit endogenous because Somalia's the kind of underlying political conditions in the 90s and early 2000s maybe made Somalia more of a fertile ground for a group like al-Shabaab than in northern Somalia,
Hmm.
even though actually many
Hmm.
of al-Shabaab's early leaders were actually members of the Isaaq clan, so many of them actually hailed from Somaliland. um,
Hmm.
but then you have, okay, so the presence of al-Shabaab brings in foreign powers, foreign intervention, more foreign assistance to combat insecurity and stuff. But then that kind of creates
Hmm.
this feedback loop of dependency on the foreign
Hmm.
powers. So it prevents the Somali state institutions from maybe building themselves up. It creates issues where the foreign powers can sometimes be engaged in proxy conflicts, or in the case of Ethiopia's
Hmm.
initial invasion in 2006, just the kind of the catalyzing of Somali
Hmm.
national sentiment,
Hmm. Hmm.
was something that Al-Shabaab was really able to exploit. So there ends up being a bit of a feedback loop.
Hmm. There seems to be a lot of interest behind. But before I come to that side of things, I wanted to quickly uh, expatiate on. So for the longest, Somaliland didn't have, we had a relative kind of like stability. But in the last year, from what you said, there's been some rupture. So what I did, the first question would be, what is behind this rupture? What is behind this, recent change? And then I guess the next question will be, um, why? Because when you had other states that were uh, trying to break away, or all these other this the rebellious state. But why did Somaliland succeed in Bida? Why did it do with little violence, or little need for, or little no violence in a peaceful way, compared to other places in Africa where, like you talk about Ambazonia in Cameroon, you talk about Biafra or IPOB in all these other places. What is different with Somaliland?
Well, I mean, I think I can answer that second question maybe first pretty quickly. I mean,
Mm,
at the moment when Somaliland declared or redeclared its independence from Somalia, the Somali state just didn't exist. There was no force there that was really going to fight them and prevent them from doing that. So that's very different from what you're seeing in Ambazonia, or with kind of the neo-Biafran secessionist movements, or even, of course, the original Biafran War, in 1967, where you had a very strong, relatively a strong state with a military. Um, that was going to be able to put up a challenge to any claims or any attempts at separation by the local population, whereas in Somalia that simply didn't exist at the time. And so Somaliland, they were already, like I said, the SNM was already kind of the de facto, in control of much of that region in northern Somalia. So it was very easy for them to just declare independence. And given the kind of political fractiousness of Somalia and those challenges with al-Shabaab and everything, over the past 30 years, the Somali state has not been able to kind of develop the capacity and the military forces and such to actually be able to kind of attempt to reassert sovereignty, reassert authority over Somaliland. Um, in terms of kind of what explains what's happened in Somaliland recently, I mean, I guess so. As some context, right? There's kind of a broader kind of nationwide. There are signs that, like, Somaliland's democratic credentials, which had really been a big selling point for the country's recognition, that those are not quite as strong as they that they led on. So particularly under this current president Musa Bihi, there's been much more kind of an escalation in the harassment and detention of journalists, of critical voices and stuff, and then notably these delays in elections, which the Somaliland government, they claim a kind of a logistical and technical issues with the way that the parties are registered and stuff. Um, but at the end of the day, it's something. It's been a very contentious decision on Bihi's part to postpone the elections, and so that's led to a lot of very vocal kind of opposition voices, louder voices within Somaliland. And some of which have been kind of repressed pretty violently from the state, and some of which have also in turn actually taken up arms. So there's actually been some kind of increased clan fighting over the past year within kind of the political core, within the larger Isaaq clan of Somaliland. But the kind of the biggest, I would say, shock to the to Somaliland has been this conflict that erupted in the eastern part of the country. So around the region, particularly around the city of Las Anod and kind of the surrounding states, those are referred to as Sultan Aganaim. So this is the area, this is kind of the eastern flank of Somaliland, the area that it kind of sees as its buffer zone with the Republic of Somalia, right? Because it claims its eastern border essentially with Puntland state. And so Somaliland has never attempted to, claim that southern Somalia or central Somalia are part of its territory, but it has always made a claim up to, kind of not far from the Puntland state capital of Garowe. And that area, that eastern area, has actually, in fact, historically
mm,
been much more contested. So the clan that lives there, the principal clan that lives there, the Dulbahante, have kind of a turbulent history with the Isak, sometimes cooperating, but sometimes fighting. And that clan was never kind of as enthusiastic about the secession, about the separation of that kind of that was declared by the SNM in the 1990s. Um, and so as a result, that kind of eastern area between Somaliland and Puntland has actually kind of changed hands a few times over the past, several
mm,
decades. But since 2007, due to kind of infighting within Puntland itself, and particularly infighting within the Dulbahante clan, the Somaliland was able to occupy Las Anod and a number of other kind of towns around it up to around 2011. And so they were able to establish pretty strong de facto authority. And so again, this is a contested region, but Somaliland, was the de facto authority there. They administered it, they governed it, all of that. The problem is though, so in kind of the last few years, that members of the Dulbahante clan, residents of Las Anod, and then a lot of Dulbahante from the diaspora and stuff, had kind of been raising concern about the growing repression that Somaliland sort of growing repression from the Somaliland government in those kind of disputed territories. They're also talking about
mm,
the, kind of grievances around socioeconomic neglect, feelings that kind of the development and everything was concentrated in kind of central Somaliland, where the Isak clan is kind of resides and stuff. That the Dolbahante didn't get as many good positions in government, that they didn't get as much aid. NGOs for a long time weren't really allowed to operate by the Somaliland
mm,
authorities in that eastern SSC region because they said, because of insecurity. So what happened was that after the assassination of one prominent Dulbahante, who was a member of the Somaliland opposition in the city of Las Anod in December 2022, you had these large-scale protests break out in the city. And then it kind of became an escalatory situation where the Somaliland authorities repressed those protests very violently. Then the protesters, drawing on their clan connections and stuff, started arming themselves. And essentially you had a
mm,
full-blown clan war breaking out by February of 2023. So
mm,
when I was in Somalia last year and throughout most of June of 2023, I managed to get up to Las Anod for about a week and spend some time with
mm,
what was then kind of the nascent SSC administration. So these were essentially kind of rebels or kind of a collection of militias and stuff, a popular uprising, kind of a lot of ways to look at them. But essentially what they were was a nascent political administration that by that point had clearly, because the protests and the conflict had escalated and everything, they were clearly rejecting, not just they didn't just have kind of one or two grievances against Somaliland, but their stated
mm,
kind of demands and their agenda was very much clearly rejecting Somaliland as a kind of nation state. So they were rejecting
mm,
secession. They were saying, we want to rejoin Somalia, but to do so as an
mm,
autonomous political unit, kind of like Puntland. So they were actually, they
mm,
were kind of arguing for their own or fighting for their own autonomy, but within
mm,
under the auspices of the Somali state, while rejecting Somaliland and the whole kind of independence separatist project. Um, and
mm,
so when I was in, Las Anod, what I saw was that the conflict had become very heavily armed, very militarized. It was essentially a frozen conflict, though, with some very kind of ossified front lines, and the Somalilanders and SSC would be shooting across kind of day in, day
mm,
out with, artillery, snipers, mortars, stuff like that. Um, and the SSC itself, because of kind of the ad hoc nature in which it was formed, it was very, in some ways, it seemed kind of, quite disorganized because the Dulbahante, like all Somali clans, they're really, there are all these different sub clans and stuff beneath them.
mm,
And so what you had is a lot of different militias forming along their own very local parochial sub clan lines, and then kind of fighting under the same banner, but there wasn't really kind of coordinated command and control and stuff. And so
mm,
at the same time, since this conflict had broken out in February 2023, Somaliland, kind of a whole war of narratives had also been breaking out as well. Because Somaliland's kind of a big part of its claim to independence and stuff was this idea that it's a democratic state, that it's stable, that it can govern its territory, that it controls its borders, essentially being all the things that Somalia is not. So when you had
mm,
this, this clan uprising, which really was, as kind of I saw it, it really was a popular uprising, elite led, a big role for people from the diaspora, absolutely. But I think, it was no less kind of genuine as a clan uprising than what you see with a lot of the clan conflict in southern Somalia. It was a pretty clear identitarian conflict.
yeah,
But
yeah.
Somaliland was trying very hard to kind of say,
I
to
was
frame
gonna.
what they were doing
Okay.
as,
Yeah,
pardon? Sorry, what was that, Michael?
yeah, yeah. Go on. If you have not finished at all.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I was
They were
gonna
trying to
say.
frame it.
What I was gonna. Go on. Go on.
Go
Go
ahead.
on.
Okay.
Yeah. I was gonna quickly just mention what you said. Like I was waiting for it. You mentioned something about uh trying to distinguish between that kind of uprising to other places where, in terms of like the scale, or did I hear you right? Is that what you're trying to say in terms of like it's not to the scale of other climes?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I was kind of, without even stating necessarily what the Somaliland position was, I was kind of,
Mhm,
refuting it a bit because they were essentially framing this as a limited counterterrorism operation. They were saying that Al-Shabaab and ISIS, these groups from southern Somalia have infiltrated Somaliland. They're trying to
mhm,
destabilize it, right? Because they were very desperate to kind of maintain this narrative that Somaliland, that there's political consensus, that the state is in control, that it's a democracy, all of that stuff. And I went there, and I mean, if those guys had really been as much Al Shabaab as Somaliland had said, I wouldn't have left with my
mhm,
head on my shoulders.
mhm,
And so,
mhm,
my view is more just that this was, whatever one's view about Somaliland, whatever one's view about, the SSC, and in my own writing on it, I wrote quite a lot about kind of the internal political contradictions of the movement. But it did
mhm,
seem very much like a genuine, this clan wanted to break away from the Somaliland state.
mhm,
So it was a
mhm,
much, in that
mhm,
sense, it was a much larger challenge to Somaliland's attempts at independence and quest for
mhm,
recognition, because it wasn't just a limited counterterrorism issue. This really was a question of Somaliland had lost legitimacy among this
mhm,
significant faction of the population, a minority clan, but
mhm,
still a very populous one that
mhm,
inhabits a lot of territory in the east.
mhm,
So
mhm,
just to kind of quickly get ahead, I mean, when I visited in June and then was writing about this over the summer, it still kind of seemed very uncertain how this conflict would end. Like I said, the things had been kind of stalemated pretty quickly. And so it seemed like, there might be a pretty decent chance, especially given the SSC and its own kind of internal political concern, kind of issues and such, that maybe that the SSC would kind of crack under the pressure and Somaliland would reoccupy the
mhm,
territory. But instead, what happened was that in late August, August 25th of last year, to be specific, the SSC forces just, they became a bit more coordinated, it seems, at the same time that the Somaliland military was kind of suffering from its own internal clan tensions, due in
mhm,
part to some of those
mhm,
larger political issues I mentioned earlier about opposition to Bihi, concern about the elections, grievances of specific subclans of the Isak against others. And so what happened is essentially the SSC in one day just kind of routed the Somaliland army and advanced about 100 kilometers to their kind of westernmost edges of what they would claim as their territory, the Dulbahante territory. So
mhm,
essentially, in a day, Somaliland lost quite a significant chunk of the territory that it claims authority over. And
mhm,
so what you have, and that was in August. The military was very kind of divided and heavily routed and stuff, and a lot of equipment and soldiers were captured and such. In the past 6 months, the situation hasn't really changed. There's kind of been this Cold War, informal front line between the SSC and then Somaliland.
mhm,
But in effect, what that means is that Somaliland's borders have just shrunk quite a bit, and its
mhm,
military has been shown to be much weaker and more prone to the sorts of kind of clan, factionalism and kind of internal fighting
mhm,
that we've always known that kind of Somalia has suffered from those issues, but it now seems that Somaliland's suffering from them as well. And so it's kind
mhm,
of a big question about, okay, where do things go from here? The SSC has already effectively gained recognition from the Somali government. So their kind of project now is, to rejoin Somalia as kind of an autonomous federal entity. Of course, Somaliland, though, still claims that territory. And now you have
mhm,
the MOU, which, one reason that I think So the MOU is very, I mean, it's a lightning rod, within Somali politics and even to a large extent regionally. And there are a number of reasons for that. Partially it's that despite all the internal divisions within Somali society, Somali nationalism and even Somali irredentism remains a very powerful political force. It's also the fact, though, so any, for those who are not Somalilanders, the notion of a country recognizing Somaliland, recognizing what they see as a breakaway province, is obviously, that's a red line for many of them. But then the fact that Ethiopia is the one that's doing it as well, and that Ethiopia is getting a military base, this kind of harkens back to, again, the long history of conflict between first the Ethiopian empires and the Somali, the Somali people, and then kind of more recently some of the more controversial, kind of unilateral military operations and stuff, and such as the 2006 invasion. There was, other operations as well earlier in the 90s where Ethiopia would cross in and conduct operations and occupy territory in Somalia. So there's a very fraught history between those two countries. Somalis see Ethiopians, skeptically at best, and as foreign invaders at worst. I mean, this is the propaganda of Al-Shabaab paints Ethiopia as essentially, a U.S. and Israel-backed Christian empire that's taking over, the Muslim lands of Somalia. And so this, when there's anger at Ethiopia, groups like Al-Shabaab try to capitalize on that. But so I would say that, one reason why this MOU has been so sensitive and such a kind of rallying call, or led to this kind of rallying cry among Somalis, both within the country and the diaspora. It's, one, this idea of recognizing Somaliland; two, the idea that Ethiopia would get, would annex, in their terms, would annex kind of land for a military base on Somali soil. But I think a lot of it also goes back to what happened last August in and around Las Anod, where for the first time, maybe in 30 years, Somalis can look at Somaliland and say, oh no, like all these things that they were saying about how they're better and more stable and democratic, and that they just have de facto authority, that, like it or not, the Somalilanders would say, well, we're the de facto authority here. You guys can't come up and touch us. But now, that's starting to crumble as well. So I think that Somalis also see, for the first time, that Somaliland's not so strong, that they don't have this kind of de facto independence that they've been, that they've been kind of using
Projecting,
to advance their, to advance their claims for recognition. And so Somalis also kind of see this as an opportunity that maybe, they can all rally together in opposition to this MOU or whatever. They can scuttle the deal, and that maybe Somaliland is actually, vulnerable and will be reincorporated back into Somalia. Personally, just one last point. I don't think that that's very likely. I think that despite all the issues that Somaliland has had, which include losing about 1/3 of its claimed territory, I also think that there's, my own understanding of this is that there's enough, there's enough support for independence among key constituencies, particularly the Isak clan. And even, all the internal divides among the Isak over the presidency and that stuff, I think there's still enough kind of support for independence and rejection of reunification with Somalia. So then we're in
So
this kind of
true.
weird position where I think both countries are taking, maximalist
Sure.
claims, essentially.
Yeah.
So where we go
Before
from
I
here
come to the
is
last, before I come
uncertain.
to the last question, there are two things I'd like you to just briefly address. So one is um, this, internal crisis within the Somaliland. So do we see, if you look at places like the northeast of Nigeria, and look at issues such as Boko Haram, this didn't start off as having they had more local. It was more local. It was more internal until maybe could have all the external forces coming to what some researchers have called, you call them conflict merchants coming in. So do we see a case where either Somalia, either Al-Shabaab, either ISIS can take advantage of this problem within Somaliland to create further disruption, to take advantage of that to further plunge it into? Is that a possibility? And the big question is, we've seen that recognition or whatever it is not politically neutral. There's some underlying strategic interest guiding all this interest. what is the interest, or what interest does Somaliland not project that same interest to, if if I just say Western world rather than say international community, if I say the Western nations, does it project, like for instance the country like Djibouti, the kind of interest it projects? Does Somaliland not project that kind of interest to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I understand you correctly, there are kind of two questions there. First,
Yeah.
regarding kind of Western interests, I mean, Somaliland absolutely, in addition to its claims, about being a healthy democracy and all of that stuff, a lot of its kind of a big selling point is its prime geographic real estate stuff, right? I mean,
Mm,
that's the context to the MOU. Ethiopia is not. Ethiopia is not, if it is going to recognize Somaliland, it's not going to do it out of any kind of benevolence,
mm,
altruistic
mm,
mindset.
mm,
If anything, with the current problems that Abiy Ahmed is facing, Ethiopia faces a strong incentive not to recognize any, potential what could be seen as a breakaway region, right? The reason Ethiopia is doing this is because it's made a shrewd calculus. Somaliland has great,
mm,
geography, great real estate, right? It's right there, kind of, around the Bab el Mandeb, the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, all of that stuff. And so Somaliland, the Berbera port is one of the largest in East Africa. It's been built up by DP World, so that's the Emirati company. Um, so there's a lot of,
mm,
I mean, if you want to talk about foreign interests and stuff, there's a lot of speculation that that the Emiratis have actually kind of brokered or played an important role in this deal, because the Emiratis are very close with both Abiy and also the Somaliland administration. Um, so there's absolutely a geostrategic calculus there, and among so like coming from the U.S. Kind of foreign policy think tank community to some extent, a lot of the debates that we see among the Africa specialists and stuff, a lot of those who advocate for a stronger relationship with Somaliland or recognition or stuff, point to those very valid kind of geographic considerations that Somaliland,
mm,
if we're coming in and we're making a good relationship, or having a good relationship with this country, that gives us, potentially access to ports, naval bases, obviously a key chokehold of global commerce, as we've seen recently with the Houthi
mm,
attacks. So again, those attacks have kind of
mm,
reignited or kind of brought out those arguments again. The issue is, though, that you still can't separate what's happening internally in Somaliland with those larger questions about the great real estate, right? I mean,
mm,
Yemen also, right? Southwest Yemen also has great, geographic, geostrategic real estate or whatever. No one in
mm,
Washington is seriously arguing about partnering with some, local criminal gang in Aden or whatever to try to build a port
mm,
there,
mm,
because we know that the situation in Yemen is so volatile that it's just not a safe place for investment right now. So
mm,
if Somaliland's kind of the value of its real estate is immeasurably or inextricably linked to its own internal stability. So if something like, and frankly, the Las Anod conflict, the SSC stuff, like there is maybe a way in which this actually just gets kind of, it fizzles out or gets mediated to some extent, because Somaliland can still actually
mm,
control the real important ports that it wants. Those are outside of SSC territory. The problem,
mm,
though, is that there's also a territory in Western Somaliland on the border with Djibouti. That's also an
mm,
area occupied by a minority clan. This is the
mm,
Aldal region. And those people, a number of them, it seems there are some clan militias there that have also kind of, spoken out in opposition to the MOU. And so maybe we're looking at another similar kind of Lasano type conflict happening in Western Somaliland, this time being on the border with Djibouti. So if the Djiboutians decide to get involved one way or another, that's potentially, they have some kind of ease of access there. So I think
mm,
that it's still very much in, I think Somaliland needs to be able to kind of reassert its and kind of like, build up that political consensus again, and reassert its
mm,
claims to a degree of stability before it can make any claims of the value of its geographic kind of real estate. Um, in terms of the um, I think your other question was about Al Shabaab. Yeah, I mean, Al Shabaab they're agents of chaos, right? They're going to go wherever they can,
yes, Rob, yeah.
and they look for, Yeah, they look for conflicts that are already existing. I mean, that's largely how they expand and how they grow, right? So when they see
Mm,
two communities in conflict, they can come in and either they can choose to support one community against another, and then they get an ally in
mm,
that, or they can try to mediate the conflict and kind of establish themselves as a sort of a power broker, if you will.
mm,
Um, so I think that, that was definitely a concern around Las Anod. It was tough kind of analytically to talk about the issue of Al-Shabaab and the Las Anod conflict because of this kind of
mm,
very vitriolic media war between and the kind of the war of narratives between Somaliland and the Somalis, where you had the
mm,
Somaliland authorities kind of asserting repeatedly without providing evidence that the entire Las Anod uprising was just Al-Shabaab, that these were all jihadists, right? Because they were trying to get international support for what they were doing.
mm,
And again, I've said, I don't that's certainly not my assessment. I think that the Somalilanders, it's pretty clear that they were overstating their case. But it's
mm,
also the case that a conflict like that, if it goes on for too long, a group like Al
mm,
Shabaab will try to exploit that one way
mm.
or another. So I don't think it's in anyone's interest to see
Yeah.
more of Somaliland be destabilized or anything. And I
Mm,
wrote an article with a colleague about a week ago about this MOU, and we essentially we focused a lot of our attention on Al Shabaab's response, and what we're
mm,
seeing so far is that Al Shabaab is certainly kind of gearing up to probably hit Ethiopia and Somaliland. That they're trying to kind of they're using this MOU as an opportunity to try to win the support of more of the Somali public, and that any
mm,
kind of further destabilization, whether it's via proxy conflict, whether it's via widespread protests in, say, Somaliland or Ethiopia, a group like Al Shabaab is going to try to exploit that. So
mm.
certainly, I think that it's a, I mean, it becomes kind of cliche to say, oh, the Horn of
Yeah.
Africa, it's in a volatile period.
Yeah.
Certainly, in the time that I've been following the region as an analyst, observer, sometimes on the ground, it's always been a very volatile region. You have
Very
Sudan,
volatile. Yeah.
Ethiopia, now this. But certainly, I think that yeah, the
Yeah.
Somaliland,
I agree with you.
Somalians.
It's not. Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. I agree with you. It does present like the Horn of Africa has always been like that. The region has always been
Mhm,
a hotspot. But if I ask you one last question,
mhm.
it's a tough one. But what do you project? Um how do you see this panning out in terms of you know what do you project if you just have like a broad overview, like in conclusion?
Honestly, it's I'm very hesitant to make any projections. I think one key aspect here is the question of kind of the unpredictability of Abiy Ahmed and of the Ethiopian kind of just
Mm,
the Ethiopian state as a whole at the moment is in a relatively precarious moment. I think
mm,
like it by some measures, Ethiopia is probably fighting a second civil war right now. It's fighting two massive kind of counterinsurgencies, one against the Amhara militias, others against Oromo, and that because of the kind of the fault lines of the country and such, those conflicts have the ability to kind of metastasize further. Abiy has also shown himself to be kind of a, I mean, he's prone to swings in his policies and his approach and his rhetoric, all of that stuff. So I think that it's important to recognize that for starters, there is a bit of a wild card here because I think that
mm,
Ethiopia is the driving force behind this, and if they decide for whatever reason, whether due to internal constraints or something else, that they don't want to move ahead with this, then we kind of go back to the status quo ante. Assuming this does go ahead, I don't, I mean, as I kind of wrote with my colleague the other day, there's not, it's quite unlikely, I think, that there would be kind of a big conventional war over this, just because
mm,
of the forces involved, and the nature of conflict in the Horn of Africa. That's like the Somali military is not really, it's not capable of invading Hargeisa. That's the
mm,
capital of
mm,
Somaliland, right? But
mm,
likewise, Somaliland isn't really capable of, you know, going in and annexing Puntland, I think, if
mm,
they, for whatever reason, wanted to do that. I mean, just using
mm,
this as an illustration. But what there is a history of in the Horn of Africa, a very long history, including in Somalia, is kind of different agents using local militias and stuff as proxies. And
mm,
there's arguably already been some of that in recent years within Somalia and Ethiopia and Somaliland. We may be seeing more of that, I think, in the coming months if this goes ahead. So I think that, rather than some big kind of cataclysmic, something like Sudan, where, all of a sudden just war starts one morning, right? Even though obviously those who were following, and as many Sudanese were kind of warning about for months in advance, you could see the warning signs. But nonetheless, you went from no conflict to a pretty big conventional war overnight. I don't really think that's what's happening here. I think what might happen, though, is kind of in the coming months, a gradual escalation of kind of zero-sum, multi-sided conflict via proxies. And so that could also, that involves various domains. So economic, domain as well. You're going to see reduced trade and cooperation. Already, the Somalis have been denying kind of overflight authorities for Ethiopian Airlines. So, the Ethiopian Airlines has been having trouble flying into Somalia. You could have, I think, reduced counterterrorism cooperation and potentially issues affecting the performance of the African Union mission, that's ATMIS, because of, disagreements between, say, the Somalis and the Ethiopians. And then, as I said earlier, I think al-Shabaab is going to look to exploit this. As I wrote in a big kind of report late last year, al-Shabaab has been looking to expand into Ethiopia for a while. They managed to infiltrate a number of units into the country in July of 2022. And it seems that they've been able to keep up some of that kind of presence there and stuff. And so I think that we could see, al-Shabaab directing attacks against Ethiopia, Somaliland, and certainly Ethiopian forces within Somalia, which are already the target of al-Shabaab attacks. But we could potentially see an escalation and kind of a higher tempo of such attacks, kind of framed as a formal campaign against Ethiopia.
Well, James, thank you for your very, very deep insight and, for affording us the time today. You're a very busy man and giving us this afternoon to speak about this. We really appreciate you today. And I say, thank you. And thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure.
You're welcome. You're welcome. We've just listened to James Barnett, the research fellow, our research fellow in a center, and the research fellow at Houston Institute. James has an extensive experience working in the Horn of Africa, including Somalia, Sudan, and also in Nigeria. Thank you for tuning in today, and I would want to encourage you to subscribe, follow us, follow our YouTube channel, follow us on Spotify, on Apple, and stay tuned for the next episode. See you.